All right. Well, we're in Romans. We're still in Romans, and I told the pastor that I would continue in Romans so that we could get finished in Romans, because I don't know. I told him it would take about 3 semesters to do Romans the way we're doing it. I kind of like doing it this way, but I hope you do too. Especially looking at the Pauline arguments, because you remember, this is a Greek document written by a Hebrew guy, who was a Hebrew scholar, by the way, remember, to Romans. So the reason this book resonates with us to a large degree is because we think a lot like Romans. Now, I told you in the past, we are Greek-minded, which is really true, but we're not as Greek-minded as we're Roman-minded. So we took we're like the Romans, We took all the good stuff from the Greeks and made it work, because the Greeks kind of couldn't do that very well. And so we kind of think in this Roman-Greek kind of mindset. And you notice that because, I've told you before, Greek is a very concrete language. Well, English is not a very concrete language. What do you think Latin is? Latin's not super concrete. Now, it's more concrete, I think, of all the Romance languages, it's probably the most concrete of the Romance languages. But, and of course, where does English come from, for goodness sakes? It's that French thing mixed with the Anglo-Saxon thing. So it's got the Germanic language, which is Anglo-Saxon, about as Germanic as you can get. And then it's got the French, probably the most Romance almost of all the Romance languages, with a huge amount of euphemism. I think it's a pretty interesting mix. And so we got this really confused language thing going on. But what's really unique about Romans is the only book that we have that really is written to the Romans, to a people that kind of think the way we do. And so we've looked at these Pauline arguments. So let me, I hit the words of the day. I only have a couple, and one is a repeat on purpose. And you could probably guess why I put the repeat on purpose in, right? Let's see, I'll go to this one. This is a repeat. E-N-T-O-L-E-S. Intoles, or intoles is the form that's being used in the text specifically. But I pointed out that this in means at or on, and tolos, telos. Isn't it amazing that almost all these words are logos and telos? Because I picked them out intentionally because of that. But a telos, we know, is that vanishing point, and this word right here, in telos, is probably the closest you're going to get in English to a conclusion. To a conclusion.
I've reached that vanishing point.
I've reached the vanishing point. To a conclusion. So when but the problem with this word is, what is this word translated as? I think I gave it to you down here. Yeah, translated a precept or a commandment. There's a huge difference we noted between a precept and a commandment, but this word doesn't mean commandment at all. It can't mean commandment. And it could be closer to precept. But anyway, we'll see it in the context. That's what's really interesting about these words. This one in Greek, see, E and Z or X, take your pick. E, P, A, T, E, R, E, N. Expaterin, from expateo. So, literally, let's see, how can we pull this word apart? This is really an interesting word. Ek in Greek. Anybody remember what ek means just offhand? It's an origin. And it's origin, and it's a preposition meaning origin, an origin. An origin, and then apatio means, let's see, literally to cheat. To cheat or delude. When it cheat in terms of money, delude is probably better. Delude, losing this one too. But I have extras. These different colors. To delude.
That's a good one.
That's good. The big deal, though, is this word together means, literally in Greek, it means to seduce wholly, to completely seduce. And of course, in a Greek sense, I'm not going to say the word because you know what it is. What do you think is being seduced in a Greek sense? I'll give you a hint. Utsuke. The mind, right? In a Greek sense, okay, seduction has nothing to do with physical in the Greek worldview, right? Because that's pathos. That's uncontrolled response. But what is seducible in a Greek worldview? The mind. See? So this is a really neat word. Origin of delusion, or origin and delude, meaning to seduce completely, to wholly seduce. No wonder we expurgated it, right? In any case, we'll see where these words fit in context.
Lionel, is the, I don't know if there's a pejorative to these words, but does it mean, we tend to think of delude as fooling someone, so it has kind of a negative pejorative to it. Is this to wholly convince or persuade in the positive sense?
You know, I think it has the exact same connotation in Greek that it does to us to a degree, but not as negative. You know, when we think of seduction, you know, well, of course, in our culture, we think automatically of the negative, right? Just because. But I don't think it means quite like that. I think it means, in a Greek worldview, okay, remember, we have our logos to telos. So if I give you a really good logos, what have I done?
Thoroughly convinced or something.
Yeah, and to use the word to thoroughly seduce. And by the way, you know, we're going to see this word because it's the translation of it is to beguile and deceive.
Satan, the great deceiver.
Well, I don't think it has that context at all.
That was the.
Lionel, I can see how you can manipulate the word to make delude be positive, but you also listed the word up there as cheap. How do you get cheap to be positive?
Well, you know, when we start thinking, you know, if I say, I shouldn't even use this word, even though this word is used by Strong's, but what Strong's means, Strong's was written back in the late 1800s, turn of the century, right? So when they mean cheap, what does they mean? What do they mean?
Not fully.
Not to pay you, right? It's a payment issue. When we think of cheat in the modern era, what do we think? Immoral and adultery, right? So delude is probably a better word. But this word, what I'm trying to tell you is this word doesn't necessarily have as negative connotation in Greek as we kind of want it to have. You know, it doesn't exactly, you know, in a Greek argument, a logos to telos, an argument to not quite a conclusion, but we know what a telos is. An entelos, of course, conclusion, but to a telos, a logos to telos, I'm not seducing you, what am I doing? I'm convincing you. Yeah. But a seduction idea in Greek would be what? I don't have the greatest telos, or I don't have the greatest logos, and yet I still can convince you.
Telos to me sounds like a con job, or you know, I'm going to sell you beachfront property that doesn't exist, you know, that kind of thing. I mean,
Well,
like it's such a great argument that I'm convinced, but there's no factual, or it's not.
Yeah, good.
Weak argument.
Well, let's see the context, because, you know, this is what's really neat about this, is seeing what the context is in the Greek. Because, you know, it's like last time, and I don't remember the verse, I think we'll go back over it, but if you remember that verse that we saw, was completely out of context to the translation. The translation was entirely not the right translation of the way that, what the words really meant. And that's why I gave you this word again. I've given it to you 3 weeks, because this word is really important, this entelos word, being a conclusion, not a commandment. And so, every time you see commandment in this chapter, chapter 7 of Romans, the word is in telos.
So this is on the mark as opposed to miss the mark.
But
Yeah.
a conclusion, if we go to the principle of writing in the argument format,
Uh-huh.
the conclusion is the author's conclusion, and they're hoping that they gave you a strong enough argument that you agree with that.
Yep.
You have the same conclusion.
Yep.
Because, I mean, it's still the author's attempt to convince the reader, the listener, or whatever, to share the same conclusion the author has.
Yep, but I'll go back to the idea of, remember, a parable, which is like Aesop's fables. Aesop's fables being parables. Having how many telos? A single telos, see? And what does the author expect? You to come up to his same one. Now, but the problem is what you're saying, exactly the problem. Remember, I've told you before, some of these Aesop's fables, the conclusions, the telos was added by the Romans. And if you read some of them, if you've ever gotten an unexpurgated version of the Aesop's fables, some of them are really weird. And you read them, and you come to the conclusion that, the moral that the Romans added, and you go, huh? What? And, well, okay, all right, I don't know how to say this exactly right, but, everything that you heard about the Greeks is not right, but everything you heard about the Greeks is right. So the Greeks really did live in kind of a debauched kind of worldview, okay, in general. I told you before, they separated certain things like religion and other things, but in general, if we were wandering around the Greek culture, we would say, this is kind of like American culture now. It's just kind of yucky, And the thing is that the Romans lived in kind of a more naive culture. In spite of what we hear, in spite of all the, whatever you call, what are those things, miniseries you've seen about Caligula, yes, sure, there were a lot of Romans that kind of lived a debauched thing. Where do you think they learned it? From the Greeks, okay? But really, the Romans are kind of living in a naivety that's really interesting. The Greeks would give Aesop's fables to their kids because they feel like, well, if you're old enough to figure it out, then that's okay, right? Where the Romans, what do you think the Romans would do? Well, they tell them what to think, but they also expurgate all the stuff they didn't think was really good. That's why a lot of Aesop's fables, you've never read a lot of the Aesop's fables. Some of them will blow your mind. You go, holy smoke, that's an Aesop's fable? I can't even mention what some of them are about. But in any case, there's a certain kind of purity in the Roman kind of worldview. So the Roman worldview, where do you think their morals go? The morals added to the Aesop's fables? To their ethos, to their very strong ethos. And so many times they'll miss the point because they don't want to get the point. See what I'm saying? So anyway, it's very interesting how this works. We're going to see the examples of both in telos and of this word, exapertein, to seduce wholly, in the context. Paul used it. So, Paul, I'm going to give you the review. Paul has given them arguments against their idols. We've been through this, against their mysterion, arguments against their pathos and fate, arguments against their domestic lives, arguments against their basic nature. And no one, not even the Jews, can follow the Torah. That's a big deal. So no one can do it. Everyone has missed the mark. The hamartia, that's the word. Everyone has missed the mark. That's a word translated sin, but in Greek it means to miss the mark. The question we've asked this question 3 times. Paul asked this question. My evil increases God's goodness, or should I do evil so that God's goodness increases? And he's answered the question 3 ways. I'm not going to go back over that. The solution to miss the mark, the solution to hamartia, according to Paul, is Jesus Christ. And Jesus Christ applies to the Romans as much as he applies to the Greeks, right? And as much as he applies to the Hebrews. And that is the answer to the inevitable question. The question the Romans want to know is, does this Jesus Christ guy apply to me? And that's the answer Paul is trying to give. That's his logos to tell us, his argument. And the bottom line, of course, is that the God of the Hebrews is also the God of the Gentiles and the Romans, and the example is Abraham. And so the bottom line thing in 24, I can't remember, I think this comes from chapter 4 or 5. But also for us in whom God will credit righteousness, that is diakosune, for us who are persuaded, pistis, in him who raised Jesus from the dead. So again, I'll mention that the fact of Jesus Christ rising from the dead was considered a fact to the Romans and the Greeks. The question wasn't that fact. That isn't what you believe. That's not what you're convinced of. What you're convinced of is who did it. And Paul very succinctly states it is God, that Jehovah God. And so therefore, since that Jehovah God applies to Romans and Greeks, then what does Jesus Christ apply to? Romans and Greeks. I mean, beautiful arguments. These are beautiful, well-founded Greek arguments. And then we are in the course of what's called the better way. And remember, Paul says the way you want to go is diakosune, which is righteousness, translated righteousness, the balance idea. But what is better than diakosune? Agathos. Agathos, which is good. Good is better than diakosune. And diakosune is righteousness. That's what Jesus Christ brings. But there is something better. And that's what he's getting into. So, in chapter 7, I'm going to go back to 9, chapter 7, 9. Once I was alive apart from the law, but when the intola, okay, this is the one, when the conclusion, you know, they say commandment, it's not commandment. When literally the position limit or the conclusion came, Harmantia sprang to life and I died. Now remember, remember why we discussed this? Okay, what brought death? Sin and not the commandment. See, if we read this properly in English, once I was alive apart from the law, from the nomos, but when the conclusion, what is the conclusion of the law?
You have sacrifice.
Well, the conclusion of the law is, remember those 36 things that sacrifice won't take care of? So the conclusion of the law is what? Death. You're going to die. Period. Die. That is the conclusion of the law. It's not the commandment of the law, right? The commandment of the law is not, and I don't have to, I'll mention it. I won't go into great detail. Remember, in Hebrew, and we studied this in Hebrews before when I did the Torah class, but in Hebrew, every law, every commandment has 3 parts. It has the chot, the mitzvot, and the shekut. I think it's shekut. Anyway, the chot is, thou shalt not kill. The mitzvot is the application of that. What is killing? Basically defining what is killing. In other words, what is manslaughter? What is murder? What is whatever? Anyway, it's not thou shalt not kill. It's really thou shalt not strike or murder. In any case, first comes the commandment. Then comes the definition of what it means, the commandment means. And finally, the punishment for it. So every commandment, every law in Hebrew thought has 3 pieces. So, in other words, for example, when it says that, you know, I have a commandment, thou shalt not murder or whatever, and then I have definition, and finally I have the what happens to you. And so, it technically is part of the commandment, right? But the big deal is, and it's hidden, and I've given it to you before, I cancel Leviticus, something or other. Only time sacrifice works is for unintentional sin. So intentional sin means that you are cut off, and the only way you can get better is through death. That is the intola of the law. So if we read this properly, once I was alive apart from the law, but when the conclusion of the law came, harmantia, the fact that I missed the mark, came to life and I died. Because what do I want to do when I learn about the law? What is my goal? To keep it and to be, and you know, okay, this is what's really important to us, okay? So let's say I'm going through my life and I'm missing the mark, I'm breaking the law, and all of a sudden, somebody tells me what the law is, what I'm supposed to do. Now what do I want to do?
Obey it.
I want to make it better. Okay, under the sacrificial system, under the Hebraic system, I have some problems, don't I? Because there's those 36 things that if I don't do, and I can't do them unless I'm in Israel, they won't work. And all my life as a Gentile, was I doing sin intentionally or unintentionally?
We didn't know
Before you
what you
knew
were
about
gonna
the
do.
law, it was unintentional.
Yeah, but they have a law in their own minds. Most sin is intentional.
Ignorance of the law is no excuse.
There you go. That's what, yes. You see what the point is here? So, okay, now I'm a Gentile and I converted to Judaism. I'm like one of these Romans. How do I fix the past?
Die and live again.
I gotta die. See, in Hebraic thought, there is no solution for those people who have converted. The assumption is that I'm a Hebrew, okay?
And Christ died for you, so it's done.
Well, that's Paul's solution, but we're not talking about Paul's solution right now. We're talking about, where you stand. See? So, who figured this out, guys? The minute the Hebrews started telling the Greeks about, they were proselytizing, right? What do you think the Greeks figured out?
What good is it?
Yeah, I gotta die.
It's
What?
a bad deal.
Yeah, this isn't the greatest deal in the world. I mean, they probably came for knowledge, for learning, for whatever, but once they got into it, they figured out, well, wait a second. You can't follow the law, and I can't, I've converted, but I did all this unintentional stuff, and you say it don't work. What do I do? Right? And the Romans got this figured out, so what do I do about it? Right?
I thought that there was people that came in, the women just had to like shave their heads and whatever, and then the men just had to be circumcised, and they were golden. Like they couldn't come into the temple fully, but other than that, they were in.
Well, I don't think so. Remember, this was a huge fight of the Judaizers. What did the Judaizers in Christianity say? In Teen Hodos say? Let's not use Christianity, Teen Hodos. What?
They had to be circumcised.
You had to be circumcised, yeah. And the apostolic fathers said, what? No, you don't have to be circumcised. But the problem is, if you're not circumcised, can you go to the temple? No, as a matter of fact, the big problem is you can't do teruma. Teruma is the food of the sacrifice. And, we think most sacrifices, you burn everything up. Most sacrifices were shared sacrifices. So you brought your sacrifice and you shared in it because you were sharing in the meal with God. This is the whole point of the Thanksgiving sacrifice. The Thanksgiving sacrifice is today, what?
Eucharist.
Eucharist. That's what we do. And so we participate in that. And likewise, the Jews would too. So an unsacrificed Jew or an uncircumcised Jewish man would not be able to participate in teruma, in eating of the sacrifice, and couldn't go to the temple, etc., etc. But it's not enough because the assumption in Jewish thought is I'm born Jewish from a Jewish woman, right? And if I'm a boy on the 7th day, and by the way, here's one of the mitzvahs that women didn't have to do. What is it? Circumcision. Women did not have to go through circumcision because remember what I told you? Women are viewed as perfect in Jewish thought. So the women didn't have to go through circumcision. They were automatically considered a member. Okay?
Well, in Jewish thought, they really didn't have a heaven,
Right.
so there really wasn't life after death anyway.
Right?
So surely the Greeks and the Romans kind of figured this was a dead end. So the point of conversion was just to become a part of a group that was persecuted a lot? I don't know. But
Who were the-
I would kind of think if I was a Greek, I was like, why am I joining this?
Well, who's the proselytizers? Who's proselytizing?
The sect that believed in resurrection.
Right, which is the
Forgot.
Pharisees. The Pharisees are the proselytizers. They're the ones who run the synagogue, and they're proselytizing, and they believe in
Resurrection.
resurrection in heaven. right? Whatever that means, see? So, again, the Sadducees were the priests who did not agree with them. So, I know this is really, see, I know what we've been taught, but have you ever thought? Have you ever thought? Well, of course, you've never been told probably. I've pointed out in Leviticus, I pointed it out in multiple places. You can go to the Talmudic sources and find it. But Paul talks about it all the time, but nobody seems to point out the fact that there are sins in Jewish thought that cannot be forgiven with a sacrifice. This is absolute truth.
That's what makes Paul's argument so incredibly wonderful to them, doesn't it?
I think so.
Don't they, you think they would be like celebrating like crazy?
Well, this is why, and I argue this is why Paul and Mary, this is why I argue that Teen Hodis' argument to the Jews was really cogent. As a matter of fact, were a lot of Jews converted in the early church?
Yes.
Yes. Yes, we want to deny it, but we know that a fifth of the population, at least, of Jerusalem was Teen Hodos. Fifth of the population. We also know that almost all the priests converted because there weren't any priests left. So it's like, wow, okay. So was it effective? Yeah. And remember, in Paulian ministry, okay, Paul, when he went and preached to the Jews, how successful was he?
He got chased out of a lot of places.
He got chased out, but how successful was he? He was very successful, because it says in the Greek that a third came to believe, and a third wanted to know more, and a third rejected, basically. So how effective is that? If every time Billy Graham preached, 1/3 of the people came up, and 1/3 wanted more information, and 1/3 disbelieved, you'd say what? Hey, that's pretty good. It resonated even more with the Greeks. But they had the same thing. It says the same thing about the Greeks. When he went to Athens, what did the Greeks say? It says, some believed, and some wanted more information, and some disagreed or didn't believe. I think that we need to revise our thinking, and that's why I keep trying to show you. When I taught Acts, we looked at the numbers, and at the numbers we could find in the Greek. And we found that, Paul is pretty successful. Well, Paul was not successful with crowds. He was great with his writing. That's the point, right? But obviously his message resonated with the Jews. His message resonated with the Greeks. And now, do you think his message is resonating with the Romans? Yeah, so much so that who was the which groups were the greatest supporters of Teen Hodos in the early empire, the late empire, Roman Empire stage? Any idea? The Roman legions. The Roman legions were hotbeds for Teen Hodos. Isn't that something? Most of them were Mithrin worshippers. And for some reason, this idea really resonated in their minds and hearts. So they went from the Mysterion of Mithras to what they saw was kind of probably a Mysterion of Teen Hodos, that is Christianity. And were very affected by it. In any case, let's keep going. The better way. Let's see, is there anything else specific? Oh, yes. I just wanted to mention, remember, okay, to the Hebrews, law is important, right? Very important. To the Greeks, is law important? Not so much. To the Romans, is law important?
Yes.
Yeah. So guess what? We see over and over again the law, the law, the law, the law. He would not write this way as much to the Greeks. In 10, I found that the very, not commandment, the very conclusion that was intended to bring life actually brought death. Why does he say that?
Because death is the key to having his sins forgiven.
That's right. Death is the key to having your sins forgiven. But why does he say that it should have brought life? The reason is because, remember I told you there's chot mitzvah. Okay, chot is what the commandment is. The mitzvah is basically the explanation of it. But there's another thing that Jews call the mitzvah. What's a mitzvah?
Like penance? Or what do you do?
What's that?
Do you turn 12?
No, that's the bar mitzvah. Bar mitzvah. Same kind of thing. Same kind of thing. That's good. That's good. That's a connection. That's connection. The mitzvot are things you do and don't do. There are more positive mitzvahs than there are negative. A bar mitzvah is the positive mitzvah that you need, that all males, not females by the way, all males are supposed to go through. The mitzvah is what? That mitzvah is, what's a bar mitzvah? What is a bar mitzvah?
You read the Torah,
Coming
you
of
memorize
age.
it, you show you've read the Torah.
It's a ritual.
The ritual is to read the Torah, which means you've done what with it?
Memorize.
You've memorized the Torah. So it's showing the community that you've memorized the Torah, which means you now can become a member of the Torah, of the community. So a bar mitzvah, that mitzvah, that's a positive mitzvah. So when you do that in the Jewish worldview, what does God do?
Check.
Check. Now, according to Orthodox Jewish thought, you're supposed to do 100 positive mitzvahs a day. So they start their day with the blessings. Blessed be he. Blessed be he is, who's he? Because you can't say God. You can't say the word God. So the way they write it even is like this. Can't say God. So blessed be he, King of the universe, who didn't make me a woman. That's one of the mitzvahs. If a man says that, Orthodox Jew, that's check mark. Okay. Check. Okay. Blessed be he that I can't remember, I think it's that I've woken from sleep again, something like that. So you get another check mark. And you do 100 of those a day according to Jewish Orthodox thought, okay? And get 100 every day, and
It's the gold star.
I guess you get a gold star because you can't sacrifice for a lot of sins. So anyway, the mitzvahs are supposed to be positive and negative. So do you see what Paul's saying here? The mitzvahs should have brought life, positives, but guess what? There's 36 that can't be forgiven, plus unintentional sin. So, the end of the law is always death. The mitzvahs are supposed to bring life, but its practice of them is impossible, so therefore they always bring punishment, death. And that's the whole point we made before. So let's go on. Let's look at 11. For miss the mark, for hamantia, miss the mark. Miss the mark. Seizing the opportunity afforded by the intola, by the conclusion, seduced expatio, exapatio, seduced me wholly, and through the commandment, through the intola, through the conclusion, put me to death. What put you to death? Did the commandment put you to death? No. The conclusion of the commandment of the law put you to death. I love this because when you start seeing this as the conclusion of the law, everything comes into focus. You begin to understand what Paul is really saying. It's not the commandments. Look, if I said the commandment put me to death, is the commandment good? Really? If the commandment put me to death, the commandment, remember, commandments are both positive and negative. What were the commandments supposed to bring? Life. But if they bring death, is that good? It's not the commandment. Does the law bring death? No. What brings death is the conclusion of not following the law. And Paul is trying to get them to see this. And of course, they, from a Greek logical argument standpoint, to me this is so obvious once you understand the context of what he's trying to do. And here's that word, by the way. What seduced them wholly?
Lionel,
Yeah.
holy as in H-O-L-Y or W-H?
W-H-O. What completely seduced him? For hamantia, seizing the opportunity afforded by the conclusion, seduced me completely. See this? It isn't the commandment that puts you to death. It isn't, and it's the hamantia that has. Did it use logos? No. It used some means of taking your mind, your suke. So Paul's pointing out something very important here. something that we think about a lot, that the Romans probably don't think about quite that much. If the suke can be persuaded wrongly, is there a problem? So he's going to point out a solution. Let's see what the solution is. We'll get there, I think, today. 12. So then, the law is hagios. The law is hagios. And the intola, the conclusion, is not holy. It's righteous. And it's good. Agathos. So the fact that I'm punished is both correct, right? And good. But remember, we've already been through this, so we don't have to go back to it again. Paul will mention again. But remember, what's the solution to miss the mark? Jesus Christ. Because he already died. So since he already died, do you have to worry about it anymore? The argument he's making is, this is not an argument. He's not repeating his argument of what is the solution. His argument now is, what is the best? What is the good? What is the thing that will bring you this life, this correctness? Okay? So in 13. Did that which is good then become death to me? By no means. But in order that hamartia might be recognized as hamartia, it produced death in me through what was good. So that through the commandment, and this is the conclusion, sin might become utterly sinful. And literally this goes back to the point. The reason I can't accomplish the law is because it shows the impossibility of following the law. And we're not talking about the 10 words. So don't get confused. What's the 10 words? We call them the 10 Commandments, but really they're a synopsis of the law. So when Paul uses the word nomos, or law, what's he talking about?
The whole tamale.
The whole tamale. As a matter of fact, when we say the 10 Commandments, what are we inadvertently saying? The whole tamale. You know, we get this idea. I don't know where we got this idea in English. Well, I think I know where we got it. We got the idea that, you know, remember in the Old Testament, in the Torah, it says that Moses brought down how much of the commandments? What did he bring down on the 2 blocks of stone? What did he bring?
10 words, really.
It says in the Old Testament that he brought it all. The whole Torah was written on those documents, on those pieces of stone. That's what it says. If you look at Talmudic sources, this is what the Orthodox Jews believe too. So he brought it all down, not the 10 Commandments. We think this because why?
Because in Sunday school in first grade, we have the picture of Moses with the Roman numeral 10
Because
and
10
the Roman
commandments will
numerals
be
to
heavy
boot.
enough if we have the whole law.
They were obviously written in Latin, because they're Roman numerals.
Yeah. Well, remember, all ancient languages are mnemonics.
Just something we teach in confirmation is that 2 tablets, one was a duplicate of the other. They were written on both sides. So the whole thing was written on one tablet, and the other one was a copy that was kind of the people's copy.
Well, I don't know. I don't think that's supportable by the Old Testament, but, you know.
When you submit it to the government, the
Yeah, then we don't get the government, right? The reason that we have this impression is because the first synagogue was about 1400, where the first synagogue you ever saw this. But this started with Christian culture. The Teen Hodos, when they started building cathedrals and churches about the year, I think, 1100s. In 1100s, what they started to do was to show Moses thing. They would do this. They would put 1, 2, 3.
And they were Roman numerals.
4, right. Roman numeral.
It's all in
So there's already a problem, right? Because it should have been.
They weren't Hebrew numerals.
They're not. Well, Hebrews didn't number them. They're not numbered. You know. And which one do you want? You take Deuteronomy.
too.
You know, well, I can't remember, did Luther take Deuteronomy or Leviticus? I can't remember, but anyway, there's two different ones. So take your pick, you know, they're about the same except for one commandment. So,
The different order.
well, not really, there's, the one, I don't think the,
Because I learned it different than what
anyway, it's a little bit different. But anyway, they started doing this. Why do you think they started doing this?
Because people couldn't read.
Because people couldn't read, right? And so it was really easy. People would memorize the commandments, right? The 10 words, and then they would point them out. And then,
I can't read.
and a matter of fact, in a lot of churches, liturgical churches, you go in there, what do they have? They have the 10 commandments up in the front. I think it's pretty cool. Just up on the front. But the first synagogue started doing this about 1400. We know because there's a synagogue, but even synagogues didn't do this. This is because anyway, why would a synagogue have Latin numbers, right? I don't know.
Because they
So-
no longer speak Hebrew.
But anyway,
It's all on the
according to the Torah, it had everything, and I can't support the fact they're copies, but whatever. But yeah, they could have been really big tablets, and Moses was a pretty strong guy. I don't know. All I know is that ancient languages are mnemonics, right? And you say, how can it include his death? Well, that's a neat question. The Orthodox Jews said because it's prophecy. He wrote prophetically what would happen to him. Well, I don't know. All I know is he broke the first set, so, you know, and then he had to do the second one himself. You know, God did the first set. Can you imagine having to do that on your own, right? See?
Well, obviously, you didn't get it the first time.
Yeah. And I would argue that what were they done in first? What were they done in?
Egyptian?
Hieroglyphics. Because, you know, you have a problem. Now, maybe they were mud, and that would have made it a lot easier, but the problem with cuneiform, you know, the cuneiform that we know that Hebrew comes from a cuneiform with a hieroglyphic base. But, you know, there's hieratic and Sephardic script that would be written, but it says it was in stone, and so the only thing that works in stone is hieroglyphics. That's what you chip into stone, where the cuneiform is pressed into bricks, into mud. So, and remember I told you that a lot of the Hebrew writing, the reason we think it is the way it is because when the Jews took both the script and the hieroglyphics, they came to a place where they had mud and not stone. So they adapted the hieroglyphic scripts to use cuneiform type thing. And of course, that lent itself to brushes, although brushes are better for the Syriac and Hieratic scripts. Anyway, this gets kind of complicated, but that's okay. That's why history is so neat, isn't it? I love history. That's why studying this from a historical standpoint.
Jews were familiar with working in mud. They built lots of bricks.
Yeah, they did build lots of bricks. And
Take what you have at hand.
And they're probably used to do a lot of hieroglyphics too, right? Because who did they hire out to be chipping the stone?
Outsource it.
Outsourcing,
To the
right?
Egyptians.
And anyway, let's go 14. 14. We know, okay, here's the important point here. We know the nomos is pneumatokis. It's spiritual. Okay, remember, the three parts of the body are sarx, psuche, and pneuma. Pneuma. So, sarx is the flesh. This is, in Greek, it's thought, and this is spirit. Literally in the Greek, psuche is the unconscious breath, and pneuma is the conscious breath. But look what it says. We know that the law, the nomos, is pneumatikos, spiritual. But I am sarx. But I am sarx. Look what it says. P prasko. Literally trafficked as a slave to sin. Trafficked as a slave to sin. And literally yoked to the Torah. Yoked to the Torah. What's that mean?
Can't get away from it.
This is a term, this is a judistic term that is used by the rabbis. a Jewish person is considered to be yoked to the Torah.
Cannot be separated.
Cannot be separated from it. That is exactly correct. Remember what Jesus said?
It's
My
interesting,
burden
by
is
the way,
light.
that the commandments look like a yoke.
Literally, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. And what he said is exactly true. This looks like a yoke, doesn't it? And if you remember, Jesus is a carpenter. What did carpenters make in the ancient world?
Yokes.
Huh?
Wood versus stone.
They made yokes. They made plows. Plows were wood, guys. They made plows. They might make pieces for buildings. Did they make furniture?
No.
Nobody had furniture. You know, the only people who had furniture was like the really richy guys. You know, they might have a little low table, maybe. But carpenters usually didn't make tables, right? Carpenters made yokes and plows. That's about it. So it's really interesting that Jesus' words were, my yoke is easy. Because this is the same message that Paul is giving. He says, we know that the law is spiritual, but I am unspiritual. I'm like flesh. Literally trafficked as slave to sin. 15, I do not understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but that which I hate, mesio, I detest, I do. This is what Paul is getting to. Because he just told them, number one, okay, they want to be redeemed, right? If once you, according to Paul, once you understand the law, and this is what they did, what were they seeking? They were seeking to understand the law. That's why they went to the Jewish synagogue. They wanted to know the law. Because they knew that there was a law, historically a law, that the Jewish people had. And this is a huge deal. And remember, Romans are attracted by the idea of the law. So they thought this was logical and good and whatever. And when they learned, and Paul's pointing out to them, and they know this, the Jews can't even follow their own law, right? They can't follow the law. Jesus Christ is the answer because everything's fixed through death, right? And the death of Christ fixes this problem. But the problem that he's talking about now is what problem? What is the problem that the Romans have, and the Greeks have, and the Jews have right now in here in this context? Same problem we have today. What's the problem?
Can't obey the law.
You can't obey the law.
They can't obey the law. They can't obey the law. Do they want to? Yeah, they say this is good. This is righteous. This is, it brings righteousness. Dikosune. I want it. But they can't do it. So even though Jesus Christ is the answer to miss the mark, what's the problem? I keep missing the mark. I keep missing the mark. And Paul is not the kind of guy that says, oh, that's okay. Just keep missing the mark. Remember, should I do more evil? The good would be greater? No. Don't bring evil into the world. So how can I solve the problem of miss the mark? 16. And if I do what I do not want to do, I agree that the law is agathos, is good. This is a direct logos argument. It's a rhetorical argument. If I miss the mark and can never hit it, what's the problem? Is there a problem with the law? No, the law is good. Who's got the problem? I got the problem. Yeah. 17. As it is, it's no longer I myself who do it. Oh, really? Why is that? It's the sin living within me. Why does he say it this way? As it is, it's no longer I myself who do it.
Well, because he's already made the argument that once you're saved, you're a wholly changed individual. He's made that argument earlier in Romans. He'll make it again in later epistles.
Bingo. He's arguing, see, he's already told you that Jesus Christ is the answer to miss the mark, right? And so they have accepted what? This Jesus Christ. So, but he's getting to a really important point, because this is our same point, right? Oh, so I should sin more so that there's more good, right? He said this 3 times, so we know that's not the answer. So let's see what he says. This is an extension of this Greek argument. If I miss the mark, it's in me, and I desire to hit the mark, then the problem is miss the mark. The problem is sin. I know he's not saying that sin does it, right? Don't get this wrong. This is a rhetorical argument in Greek. So just because it's sin doing it and not you necessarily, right? The devil made me do it. That's not what he's saying. And look what he says, and he answers this question himself for us. I know that nothing good lives in me. That is, in my sinful nature. For I have the desire to do what is good, but I can't carry it out. I desire to miss mark, but I can't. For what I do is not the good I want to do. No. Literally, and we translated this evil. It's not. It's kakos. I won't actually tell what kakos means, but we've been through this before. Kakos means worthless. What's the worst thing to a Roman? To be worthless. So, to the worthless, I do not want to do this, I keep on doing. So he's transitioned again from the law to the good. From the law to the good. 20. Now, if I do what I do not want to do, it's no longer I who do it, but the sin living within me that does it. This is called a paradox. There's a paradox because the miss the mark is miss the mark no matter what. Okay? Think about it. If I have missed the mark in me, and it's doing stuff through me, it's still missed the mark. It's still me, right? We want to see this as an English kind of argument, right? In an English argument, we would say what? The devil made me do it. It's not the sin making me do it, right? But in a Greek worldview, what is it? The Greek worldview says you are, I like to say, I used to tell my kids, you are what you do, right? To them, to the Romans and Greeks, this is self-evident. You are what you do. Paul's not saying that the sin inside of you is the thing that exculpates or makes it okay to do it at all. He's just saying that what?
It's a statement of fact.
Well, if this is me and I got sin, what is it possible to do?
Move the mark.
What if I could take this out? Let's see what he said. 21. So I find this law at work. When I want to do good, and look what he said. I find this law at work. This law at work. The law at work is when I want to do good, evil is right there with me. Right? It's a transition. 22. For in my inner being I delight in God's law. They do, right? That's why they joined the synagogue. That's why they went as Romans and Greeks to the synagogue, because they delighted in God's law. Even the rabbis, this is one of the things in the Talmud and in the Psalms. What? I delight in the Word of God. I delight, and by the way, the Word of God is obviously the law. I did not light in the nomos of God. 22, for in my inner being I delight in God's law. But 23, but I see another law at work in the members of my body, waging war against the law of my mind. What's mine? Waging war against
Suke.
my suke, and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within my members. This is another transition. We're transitioning from miss the mark, that is missing the mark of the law, to the law that makes him miss the mark. Now, the point of this is a direct relation to pathos. Because what does the Greek worldview tell us about pathos? About
You're faded.
you're fated. You're
Out of
fated.
control.
And Paul is, what is Paul telling them?
You can change your fate.
Well, no, he hasn't said that yet.
He's getting there.
Well, let's see if he gets there. He's telling them right now that what? They are fated.
Yeah.
Fated. Now,
Sin no matter what you do.
You're gonna sin no matter what you do, that's what he said, you're fated. But he also gave him hope, because if sin's part of you, you could theoretically get rid of it, right?
Christ is the
See?
answer.
But remember, Christ is the answer. You know, this is post the answer. The answer's already been given, right? These people are people who have Christ, so therefore they have solved the problem of missed the mark. Except for one part of the missed the mark problem.
They keep saying.
They keep sinning. See, I'm trying, yeah.
But isn't the issue that we have and they had is how do you isolate sin? I mean, it's the same thing in the I mean, if there's a disease, how do you isolate the disease because the rest of the body is healthy? So how is Paul gonna tell us how that happens?
Let's see, 24. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue? Literally, rume. Who will rush or draw me from this soma? Soma. What's soma?
All three.
All of it. Who will rescue me from death? And literally he says death, because why does he say death? Thantos. What is Thantos? It is the entolos. Who will rescue me literally from this conclusion? 25. Thanks. Charis. Charis. Remember, I hate the fact that they translate this charis. Charis means, charis means thanks, graciousness. Thanks be to God. Charis be to God through Jesus Christ our Lord. So then I myself in my, and he doesn't use the word suke, he uses the word, I myself in my nous, in my intellect, am a slave, a doulo, to God's law. But in the sinful nature of a slave, to the law of harmantia. So what he has done is he set up this duality. He has a law, the law specifically of God, and it is a law of nous, of intellect. Okay? And there is a law of harmantia, which is the law of, we translate it sin, but it's missed the mark. So intellectually, I am, my logos telos tells me what?
God's taking care of it.
Okay? But there's this other law affected through the soma. And we're going to have to wait because, well, I'll make this one mention. Remember, he has been talking this whole time, and I'll remind you again, about suke. Suke. And now all of a sudden he made a transition to nos, and we're going to see that he makes another transition to pneuma. Pneuma, I'll give you a hint, is the answer to miss the mark. Anyway, as he's describing here. Thank you, Father, for your word. We pray you look after us. Take care of us this week. In your name we pray, amen.
Up to this point, it sounds a little Freudian.